So, I was lucky enough to play the beta of the new Marvel Avengers game over the weekend, and I'm here to talk about it. Now, note before, I haven't really been following this game much at all. I saw a stand for it at EGX last year, when there were like queues going outside of the convention center, so I didn't really bother queuing up for it, but I have seen promos and trailers and gameplay footage and stuff, so I'm not completely blind, but I am going in with maybe a lesser level of knowledge than maybe you might expect. And that's not out of a lack of interest, by the way. I've just been super busy, and to be honest, it's not at the top of my most excited games list, but I mean, I have been watching it vaguely in the background. But coming at this with fresh eyes, that could be a point in my favor. It's also worth pointing out right at the top, I'm going to say some critical things, fully in the knowledge that I don't have all the info as this was only a beta. I can only say that they're more like expressions of what I experienced and how I think the full game might be, and I might be wrong about that. So take it with a handful of salt. I know these things are maybe subject to change, or that the full game will have more to offer. I'm just commenting on the things that I saw and experienced. So, without further ado, I'll start as I have done in the past, by talking about the main event, the gameplay. In the gameplay, I'm going to start first of all talking about the combat. The combat in this game is okay, like firmly okay, nothing special or inventive. It takes a lot of cues from the Arkham games in how it works with the dodges and counter systems, etc, etc. It feels a little more clunky and a little less fluid. Some characters are better than others for this, but it makes sense for those characters. For example, the Hulk doesn't feel fluid because he is not. Black Widow does. But yeah, the combat is less fluid, but more varied because of the increased roster. There is a feeling of compromise that the combat is less punchy and solid than the Arkham games, to account for your hero abilities and the roles different characters play. The hero abilities are pretty cool. You get an offensive, a defensive, and a support ability, which is a nice way to spice up combat. You also get intrinsic abilities for some heroes. Kamala gets to warp her body around and get a bit bigger, increasing damage done and dodge. The Hulk rages, increasing his damage and regenerating health for each kill. Tony gets a repulsor field, Black Widow gets a grapple, etc, etc. Yeah, the combat is slightly less punchy and deep than in the Arkham games, but that's to make it feel more varied, and it still feels just as tactical. I also want to talk a bit about traversal, since it's a relatively big part of the game, the platforming and the like. Each hero has a unique traversal ability. Kamala's swingy arms, Tony's flight, Hulk's war jump, etc. It adds a nice level of differentiation between each character, but some heroes seemingly have the same traversal abilities. For example, Kamala and Widow, for instance, both use a form of a grapple, something I imagine Spider-Man does in the full release of the game. Thor and Tony both fly, things like that. The traversal is good and it feels fun, but you do get the sense that there are these traversal groups, which is fine, to be completely honest. The level design is interesting too, split basically into traversal/platforming segments and battle areas. That is, at least for story missions. Towards the end of the demo, it became clear that the story missions are structurally quite different from the normal missions. Normal missions tend to be much sandboxier, wide open areas with enemies in different camps and locations you can aggro on your way to whatever destination you choose. I get why the demo puts the story missions front and center, but I think I prefer the wide open sandboxes of the normal missions. It feels a bit less formulaic. I like the freeform nature of the normal missions, but the story missions are a nice mix-up. That's not really how the demo presents itself, which is fine, but I went in thinking that the game would mostly be like the story missions, which I don't think it is, it doesn't appear to be. Speaking of story, that brings us to part 2.
You know that old saying, never meet your heroes? Well,
the old story is also sort of meh. I mean, at least what's presented, but it's a Marvel story, so it's difficult to do anything too amazingly inventive. The Avengers are disassembled after some collateral damage gone wrong. Funny how often that happens. And it's up to plucky Miss Marvel, Kamala Khan, to reunite them. If that feels familiar, it's because it's basically a very similar plot to Civil War. the Sokovia Accords breaking the group up, etc., but it's got, some differences. But yeah, the plot isn't exactly inventive either. The characters now are so familiar to use that they can't really do anything more with them, at least from what was in the demo. Bruce is maybe a bit more bitter than he normally is, he has a nice beard, but still he fundamentally can't reconcile with the Hulk. Tony is still an arrogant billionaire, Thor is still brash and out of touch, etc. But Kamala is a nice breath of fresh air. But I have the feeling she might be a bit more divisive. Her character revolves around hero worship of the Avengers, and feeling like she finally gets to be part of the team is a big part of her drive. She remarks upon stuff that fans might notice, and a large section of the demo is just hearing her go through a corridor and checking out a bunch of references to past Avengers adventures. She's a great audience surrogate because Marvel fans might well feel like she does, but she also might be a little grating. Her squeeing over Quinjets in Captain America's shield can only happen so much before it gets a bit over the top and self-referential. She also has a weird plot point where she wants to get rid of her powers and feels judged and ashamed of them, but that doesn't really make that much sense either. It sort of comes out of nowhere. But then it is a beta and the story is taken out of context. I'd like to see where these feelings come from and where they go, because the I have superpowers and feel different from my peers thing is a little done if not used well. Her and Bruce Banner, or Bruce Dadner, have a cute dynamic where Bruce can't really help her because he's a bit awkward, and it's very sweet in a sort of father-daughter dynamic sort of way, which is a big plus. I really like that dynamic. The showmanship of it all is also pretty great. The cutscenes and set pieces look amazing, just like in the movies, and at times it's very cinematic, which is great. Just a shame the plot behind it isn't so inspiring, but I'm not really of the opinion that has to be a big deal. But who knows? Maybe the plot gets a bit better than what feels like a recycled Avengers movie plot, and maybe I'm being unfair. I know that's sort of a subjective interpretation, but it is my review, so of course it's my opinion. I'm not optimistic the narrative itself gets that much more interesting, but I do think the available character dynamics could be explored in a nice way, so it's not all bad from a mere story or textual perspective. So, final thoughts and bits and bobs. Is the game good? Yeah, of course it's good. This much money and time thrown at it, it's hard to be a completely irredeemable game. But is it particularly new or exciting? Also, not really. It's pretty derivative of a lot of things in a way that a lot of games are, but I maybe think I was hoping for something a bit deeper. The loot system is boring, and honestly, if it were going for like a Destiny/Borderlands type vibe, I think they pretty much missed the mark, but that's not a big deal to me personally. It's nothing new or amazing, but the things it does well, aside from loot, it generally does them pretty well. Which makes this game for me like a solid 7 or 8 out of 10, much as I actually don't really like number scores. I think it's helpful in this instance. I think to get higher, for me personally, it has to really wow with extremely well carried off mechanics or some fresh and inventive ideas, which this isn't. It's a proficient beat 'em up with a decent level of character customization and fun combat, wowing set pieces, and good characters. But it's so far hampered by a quite boring loot system, some clunkiness in combat, and a story that's shaping up to be nothing special, a bit too obvious and formulaic. This all goes without saying, it was only a closed beta, and it's not the full picture, as I mentioned at the top. But as a thing that might convince me to buy, I don't know if I'll get it at release. For me, it's if I randomly have a spare $40 or if it's on sale sort of buy, but not one I'm going to save up for, if that makes sense. But if you're a Marvel fan, you don't need me to tell you this. People looking for a Destiny or Borderlands experience, do your own research, because I'm not convinced.